Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, my bad. Okay, so you have had, you're married and you have 7 children, um, and you want to go to university. How did you apply to Brandon University and why Brandon University?
Okay, that's a bit of a story.
Yep.
I'll make it as concise as possible. Um, I, my brother, my youngest brother, graduated that year, and from high school, and he wanted to go to university. So he heard from a friend that Brandon University was offering a program that would perhaps not look at the precursors that need to happen before you go to university. So he says, I'm going to apply. And he applied, and about 2 weeks later, he came over to the house, to my place, and he said, look what I've, and he had, his application had been accepted, and they were welcoming him to come for orientation on such and such a date. And he showed me, I looked at it, and I started crying. And he thought I was crying because I was so proud of him, um, and that he was happy to say that he'd be going. The reason I was crying was because I always wanted to go to university, um, but I never had the chance since I got married shortly in the last year of my high school, when I came home from Saskatchewan. And I told my parents I wasn't going back, and I said I'd finish high school somewhere else. And and following that, I got married, and I never had the chance. So this was the chance that I was looking at my brother, and here he was going to go to university, something that I had longed for many, many years. And so I asked him, I said, how do you apply? Oh, he says, you have to finish your high school first. And I decided that I was going to do that at some point in time. And I thought university life was going to be further down the road for me. At this point in time, I had 3 preschoolers, 2 preschoolers, one that was just entering kindergarten, and the other 2 were just preschoolers, and a young baby, a few months old. And so I decided to write a letter. I wrote a letter to the University of Brandon, and it, I wrote a biography, how I was forced to go to residential school at the age of 5, and that I didn't know. I knew where the school was because it was next door to where we lived, a mere 5 to 7 minutes away. So I knew where the school was, and how how close it was. And when my mother never, both my parents never spoke about it. They didn't say, "Oh, this is the school you're going to attend," blah blah blah. They never said anything to me. Never spoke about that building. One morning, my parents woke me up, woke us up, and said to my brother and I, "You're you're going to go to school today." I jumped out of bed and was so happy. And I looked, and my mom brought some clothes for me, and she said, "Here, put this on." So and they were brand new clothes. I was so proud. And she gave us breakfast and then got us ready, and she said, let's go. The only feeling I had for my mom was that she was very sad looking and that she didn't talk much about anything. And we left the house and started walking. And we walked, it was just, like I said, a very short distance. And it,
Sorry, I'm like, remember that this story has already been told in the first video.
oh, okay.
So what's, like, this story is like, so this is the fourth stage of your life. So this is when you first go to university, and then you become a teacher.
Okay. So we'll delete all that because it's been told already,
Yeah,
right?
you've already told that part. Yeah.
Okay.
So we need to start this story about, like, so it's a stage of your life when you're an adult and you're gonna go to university. So the question around university is, what was it, like, why did you pick Brandon University? What was it like moving to Brandon? What was university like? What's your first teaching job? And then what made you want to continue? And then what else did you do in your adult life in education?
Okay.
So we can,
Forego the other part.
yeah, forget all that. So if you want to start at,
Just,
I guess the first question should be, why did you want to become a teacher? So, and then you can lead, so from there, I long to be a teacher, however you want to say that. And then you can talk about your story about moving to Brandon with the kids. And then from there, then you can talk about university life, and then leading up to your very first teaching job once you were a teacher.
okay. The summer that we left our home community, I had.
Why don't you start with why you want to be a teacher? Because that will lead into you going to university, deciding to go to university.
Do you want me to talk about who inspired me? I
Just your
don't
reason?
wish to go that way.
Yeah, no, and I don't want you to either, but just, maybe you even just start with, I always wanted to be a teacher, like I've wanted to be a teacher. When did you want to be a teacher? When you were little?
No.
When you,
When I met that someone,
okay,
and I liked her.
yeah.
My very first teacher
maybe
was
why-
my very first real teacher was a young novice who came to the residential school I was in, and I was in grade 7. And I met this person who.
So then if you don't want to talk about her, then why don't you say that, like your dad and your like your mom and your dad both said you were really smart and they always pushed you and you knew you were smart, so you always had the dream of becoming a teacher. Why don't we just do that? And then you don't have to talk about that story.
Okay. When I was a preschooler, my parents, especially my dad, doted on me because he thought I was so very intelligent and so smart. So I was always getting encouragement at home. And when I entered school at age 5, I didn't know that I was going to live in that building. And I lived there for 10 years, going home only during holidays. At that time, it was mandatory for a little one for Treaty Indians, and I'll say Indians because that was the language that we used for us back then. And when I was in grade 7, I realized that I loved reading and I loved classrooms, going to class, because it was a draw for me, and I loved it because in front of me was a real teacher, a teacher with credentials. So that kind of spurred me on for it to have that. I would have had the love of learning anyway. And but seeing someone that was an actual credentialed teacher, I glowed, and that was my one bright spot. So as the years went on, I wanted to be a teacher. I thought, oh, this might be a good place for me, a good thing to do in life. Unfortunately, I left early. I had to go to another province, a province that I'd never heard of because I was on the reserve and sheltered, not sheltered, but incarcerated in a building that I had no access to anything. But I still wanted to go into teaching. How? I didn't know, because I really didn't know anything. In my last year of high school, there was a group of teachers out there that wanted me to be the valedictorian. I didn't know what a valedictorian was, and I didn't ask. In my role as a student over the years, we were never to ask questions, just take orders. And so when I went home at Christmas time, I told my parents I wasn't going back the last half of my grade 12. And they didn't say anything. They just said, well, okay, if you want to do it that way. So I stayed home, and during that last half, I had this yearning. It was really super wanting to go to further my education. I missed it. That year, that summer, instead of finishing, I got married. I got married and had children in the next 10 years, and 10 to 12 years perhaps. And I lost my mom then. My mom died young, and I was still a teenager. And so life went on the raising children. And when I had my 7th child, that yearning was always still there, that I wanted to go to university. At that time, I didn't know the yearning to become a teacher wasn't quite as strong as it was earlier on. The summer of when my youngest son was born, when my youngest child was born, my younger brother was accepted at university, had just graduated, and he showed me, and I cried. I cried because I was so envious of him that he had his diploma, and he was doing something I'd wanted to do all my life. So after that, I decided on my own to write a letter, and I chose Brandon University because that's where my brother was going to go. And I didn't know where Brandon was even. I was that naive. And I wrote a big long letter detailing my life, etc., etc. And this was in the early summer, and the last month in August, I received a letter from the University of Brandon, and they said, we received your letter, and based on what you wrote, we're inviting you to come to Brandon and to be interviewed and to go into the special program that we have. I thought that was the greatest gift ever. And I'm thinking, well, I have 7 children. What am I going to do with them? So my husband had a good job. He was, he was taking care of his family, and we had a vehicle, but I had no rights. Back then, we had absolutely, women were subservient to their husband. And so one day, and time was coming closer, and I, tried to solve my problem and say, how am I going to tell my husband? So I decided that there used to be, in the next town, they used to have bingo back then, which they still do, I guess. And I asked him, he was on the 4 to 12 shift, and I said, can I borrow the car? And he looks at me, something I'd never done. He says, why? He says, I said, because I heard there was a big pot and I'd like to go and win that money. And he said, okay. I didn't even have a driver's license. So I dropped him off, and he said, okay, you pick me up at 12. And I said, okay. I turned the car around, went back to the res, and ran into my brand new house. And I told my oldest daughter, I said, pack the kids, we're leaving, we're going to Brandon. Oh, no questions asked, pack the kids. And we left. I wrote a note to my husband, and I said, I left to go to Brandon, and I'm going to university. I've taken the kids. Talk to you later. And we didn't even have a phone. There would have been no way to communicate. And I wrote, love, Mary. And that's how I ran away to go to post-secondary. I drove, and we must have gotten there about 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock, I don't recall. I had to ask directions as to how to go to university, how to get to Brandon. And then when I got there, I had a phone number where my brother was, and he had this one little room that he had rented. And so I finally found it with the help of the Brandon police, and I found his apartment, a baby in my arms, and 6 other children following. Knocked on the door, can't open the door, and he says, what are you doing here? And I said proudly, I'm going to university. And he said, oh. He opens the door and says, this is it? Where are you going to sleep? Oh, I have blankets in the car. Brought the blankets, and we all slept on the floor. That started my life, another life. And the next day, I gave instructions to my daughter and told her, I said, I'll be gone for about an hour, and I'll be back. Okay. And we had packed food, and feed the kids, and I'll be back in an hour and a half. I walked in, didn't know where I was, asked questions, asked, where to go, and with the letter in my hand, and they showed me to a room. I must have been a counselor, and I walked in, and she says, "What can I do for you?" So I gave her the letter, and I said, "I'm going to university." And she looked at me, and she said, "Wow, that's great." And so she started asking me questions, and during the interview, I opened up and I cried and told her a little bit of my story, and she became my guardian angel. She helped me immensely, and I'll always be thankful to her. Long story short, that started my career, and in 2 years I received my first undergrad and a teaching certificate that I could take to any place and apply anywhere and to teach elementary. I applied to a school division. I didn't want to go back to my res. Oh, I'm forgetting that I forgot to say that my husband found us the following week at my brother's place. He had quit his job. He had hired someone to come out to where we were to pick us up. And so when he arrived, he said, "Why didn't you tell me that you were coming?" And I said, "Because you would have said no, and I would have listened. But now that I'm here, I am never going back." And he says, "Well, that's okay, because I quit my job, and here I am." So, and just like that, he didn't want to leave his family. And so we started another path, a path that that we've journeyed together and with the kids. And as I said, we came back 2 years later, and I said, "We're not going back to the res. I'm going to apply to the school division that's hiring." And I went for the interview, and in the middle of the interview, I was hired. And it was an elementary school based on a reserve, but governed by the provincial, governed by the province with a school division. And that was my first teaching job. And that my principal was about 30 to 40 kilometers away. And he showed me the classroom. He said, "You're going to have 3 grades, 1-room classroom, a kindergarten, grade 1, and grade 2. And he says, you will have a lady from the reserve that's going to be your assistant. Other than that, you're on your own." And he said, there will also be a resource teacher that will come and kind of show you the ropes. So here I was on a res teaching from the school division. And I was looking at these little kids in my room and thinking, I wonder if they have their own language. I wonder what they do on this reserve. And I should meet the parents, I'm thinking. So that morning, my assistant, the one that was going to assist me and show me the ropes, came. And she drove this fancy little car. And she arrived there and she said, "Oh, what would you like to know?" And I said, "Well, I want to know about the community." I said, "It's close to my own home community, and I would like to know more about the community, the parents, the grandparents." "Oh, you don't need to know about that." She says, "I brought you a package that will give you some information about how to teach these children. I know you all come from a disadvantaged background, you're disadvantaged." At that moment, I blew up. Nobody calls me disadvantaged. I said, "I'm not disadvantaged." I said, "I went to university." And she said, so did I. And I said, "Well, you know what? I'm just as good as you are. And I am now a teacher. I'll show you my credentials." And her face went red as her hair was. And she said, "Oh, excuse me." She took her package and left. And that afternoon, the principal came. And I said, "I'm going to do things differently." I said, "I want to go and see the parents of my students. I want to get to know them." And he said, "Well, you have to teach from a curriculum, from what the province tells us to do." And I said, "But this is a reserve." And he said, "Well, we have to do what we have to do." So I did what I thought was good for the kids. I visited the families, and before, about 8 years before that, there was a big car crash. And people in that car were all parents, young parents. And I had 8 orphans in that school. 8 total orphans who didn't have parents at all. And they were just shuffled here and there to relatives. And so I began to know them as people, not just my students. And the school that I was in was part of the band office as well. So I went to see Chief and Council, and I said, "I'd like to do things in a different way. Not to have them sit in rows and just sit there and and try to teach them how to read, how to follow the curriculum." And I said, "I don't want to do it that way. First of all, I wanted to see if they know their language." And the one counselor said, "You know what? You're the first Indian teacher that we've had here." And he says, "I want you to do what you feel is right." So that's how I started my teaching career. I stayed there for 2 years, and then I was offered another position with the University of Brandon. But by then, there was kind of a movement that was happening in our Indigenous communities across the nation. And I knew that there was things that needed to be done. So I accepted that position, and my job there at the university was to go into the communities and recruit potential teachers, Indigenous, I'll say Indigenous now. It was still Native teachers back then, and Native people, I should say. And so I I traveled a lot to communities, Métis communities, First Nations communities, and I began to recruit people to come to university. I did that for a few years, and then I decided that I was going to go back to university. In the meantime, I was offered another position to work for the Indian and Northern Affairs of Canada in the office in the city of Winnipeg, a Manitoba region. Excuse me, and they offered me a position that would propel me to a superintendent position with the Indian and Northern Affairs for education. And my job was to go and to see what the Native people wanted in a certain geographic area, and then bring all those needs and wants to the big kahunas in the office. And so I did that, and but there was rumblings all over at the time, and people were starting to know how tightly controlled we were as Native people. And after that, I just 4 years of it, I came out of there. Oh, I was not a superintendent, but I was only, my title would always be only a trainee. So I was a trainee. They always corrected me on that. You're not an assistant superintendent. You're not a superintendent. You're a trainee. So that was my title. And I was going to be there for a number of years before I ever got a promotion. So I thought to myself, well, I had a little bit of, fight in me by then. And I said, I'm quitting. I'm not enough of this. I came out of there with, I received something, and that was ulcers. After that, there was another school division that opened. It was run by the province, Frontier School Division. So I applied there, and I got the job. And it was another traveling job. My job back then, in that position, was to be, to find in the frontier communities students whose grade level was not offered in their home community, and to bring them to communities that had high school, and that they would go to high school and complete their high school diploma. So that was my job. I did that for another 4 years, and it was a great job. I liked it. I liked the travel. I liked the people. And then I just decided enough of this. So I'd like to actually go into a classroom and teach. So I went to university, and I got 2 other degrees, and this was now in the 80s, and my children were in school, and excuse me, dry. My children were in school and progressing nicely. I vowed that I would never, I never wanted them to know, to learn about their background. I didn't teach them my language. My husband and I decided that together, and not to have anything to do with our cultural teachings. that was the biggest mistake we made in our lives, because only one of my 7 children even understands the language. And she understands it because her grandpa taught her and only spoke to her in the language. And unfortunately, my dad had passed at the young age of 62, so she only had 7 years with him. It was then that I decided that this was going to be my life, was to devote my time with indigenous communities, indigenous peoples, and unfortunately, I never did. We still didn't talk to our kids about art. Both my husband and I, my late husband and I, did not talk about our time in residential school. There were no stories. It was one evening I was watching TV, and there was a journalist, and she was interviewing and someone, and I looked, and I saw someone from our reserve, in fact, a schoolmate of ours, and he was being interviewed, and he was talking about his time in residential school, and he was telling it to all of Canada. And so I called my husband, he was in, I said, come and watch this. And he came in, and here we listened to Phil Fontaine talking about his time and how horrible it was, and how we were indoctrinated, and how we were abused. And George looked at my husband, looked at me, and he said, how dare he? That was our first reaction, denial. Our lips were sealed so tight that even listening to someone opening up like that threw us in a panic. I was teaching at the time, and I recall the next day I phoned my parish priest, the parish priest of the church I used to attend. And I said, I don't know who you are, and you don't know me, but I am a drop-in parishioner of your church. And so I introduced myself, and I said, did you happen to watch the news? And he said, yes. And I said, you know what? It wasn't that bad. That's how indoctrinated and brainwashed I was. Of course, things have changed. And I worked for a school division for a number of years. And slowly but surely, the faces of our students, of the students in the classroom, were like me. The kind of brown that I have were the same kind of brown that was in front of these many little students. And I began to think, you know, it's been such a horrible, dark history that we've had as people, indigenous people in this country, that we need to change, perhaps change a little bit, change the system that these children are exposed to, especially us, They need to know the truth. So it was, and so that began our journey. We started the school in 1990, I believe, an Indigenous high school, right in the center of downtown in the North End. And we called it Children of the Earth. And it still stands today, and it's still running very well, I might add. And they're learning about their culture, they're learning about their language. In fact, we had a program for Ojibwe, which is Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe Nikit, and we also introduced the Cree language. So students in that school had the opportunity for the very first time to know what their history, what their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents had to go through 150 years. And in 2008, I was in Ottawa listening to the then Prime Minister Stephen Harper giving the very first apology from the highest, our government here in Canada. And I was sitting in the gallery, and there were only 100 of us, of residential school survivors, that were invited. And I just happened to be one of them. And I sat in the gallery, and I looked over the place in the House of Commons that made laws and in our country. And our Prime Minister was going to apologize to us for those years, so many that left home to go to school, so many that didn't return home, and so many that did not have the best that they could have had, and therefore ran, they turned to something else. And it was a grueling and ugly lifestyle. And it was, as our Senator, Judge Murray Sinclair had said one time, it was education that got us into this, and it's education that will get us out of this. So I took that to mean that, that's what we have to do. We have to change the system. We have to tell the truth. We have to tell our truth, and we must talk until such time that we are not only acknowledged, but validated and authenticated, and that we contribute as much as anybody else, and that we are just as good as any other person in our country. For the majority of my early life, I believed the only saving grace for us was to follow the rules of the government through the churches that ran the schools. And in my case, in the school that I was in, for the first 6 years, I never had a teacher. We didn't have teachers. They said they were teaching us. Yeah, we knew how to pray, we knew how to listen, we knew how to listen to bells. But as far as knowing and actually doing and not just rote learning, that never happened until until when I was in grade 7 and I was promoted to grade 8. And I believed that I could be something, I could do something for my people, and that was the best way was to become a teacher. I've done that, and I'm happy that I'm still doing that, although I'm officially retired, but not really, because I am now an elder in a school division that I am so thankful for, because they're moving, they're one of the leaders, and there are two of us, a male elder and myself, and we are starting our 14th year, and we have all kinds of amazing partnerships and amazing programs that focuses on our education system and Indigenous education. And that's what I'll continue doing until, I'm slowing down a bit now because I'm older, but I still do what I love to do. I don't know if that covered. I'm sorry, but
No, that was good. No, I didn't even need to ask you any questions. You just flowed.
Pardon?
I said I didn't even need to ask you any questions. You just flowed in your
Okay.
stories.
Were there any other questions that
Let me look.
I missed?
I actually think that you touched on everything. Like, if, you talked about Children of the Earth, did you want to talk about where you retired from, Red River College, or do you just want to leave it?
To talk about the time
Do you
that,
want to mention Red River College, or I
Oh,
don't really
okay.
think you need to, but
well, following Children of the Earth, I decided to leave for a bit because I wanted some community involvement on a reserve. So I left that and I became director and principal of a reserve, not my own, but some other reserve. And I did that for 2 years, and then I was asked to apply for a position as Dean of Aboriginal Education at Red River College. So I became the first woman dean, in Native or Aboriginal. We've had so many different names tacked on to us that at that time I think we were called Aboriginals. So I became the first Aboriginal woman. There was a male that was before us. So not only did we pave roads for, for us generally as to promote who we pride in, it was also, to not, we weren't in the background anymore as women. And today we have all kinds of leaders. They were there all this time. They were just waiting for the right time to be, or to forge pathways for always the seventh, looking to the seventh generation. And now we talk about what the eighth generation will look like. And I believe that the eighth, the eighth generation at that time, we will no longer need to pursue or fight for who we are, but to be recognized just like any other Canadians. After all, we were always here, and we're still here, and don't think we're going anywhere. We'll be here. Miigwech.